The first tip I have is actually for when you're casting on. I like to tell students, if I'm teaching them how to do finishing, that you should start thinking of your finishing when you actually start your project. And this is what I mean. This is just one of the things I mean. When you cast on, try to leave a long tail so later you can go and sew your seams up with that tail. You don't have to start a new thing, because if you start a new piece of yarn, not only do you have to weave in this one, you'll have to weave in that end. So it just saves some time and a little bit of weaving and effort, and looks neater if you just leave a tail in the first place. A good rule of thumb for joining new yarn is to never knot it. What we like to do is we cut or pull or rip the yarn, the old one, or maybe it's just running out, but try to notice when you're running out of yarn, and you want to do it at the edges of your yarn, of your knitting. We'll talk about if you're knitting a piece in the round that has no edges in just a second. I'll show you what I do then. So to join the new yarn, you probably want to avoid knots because they can come undone, but if you need to get started with a knot, you can make a loose square knot right there and knit with your new yarn. But you're going to have to come back later, undo this, and weave in those ends. Don't leave the knot there. If you leave the knot there, most likely it's going to loosen up and come apart while you're wearing the sweater. You don't want that. I don't knot my yarn when I join a new piece of yarn at the edge. What I do is I overlap the new yarn and the old yarn, leaving again about 6 inches of a tail, and I knit the first stitch and sometimes even the second stitch with both of those strands held together. And then I drop the old yarn. You want to make sure you drop the old yarn. I can't tell you how many times I've dropped the wrong one and then run out of yarn halfway through the row, and continue knitting with the new source of yarn. You can also do this a couple stitches in. You can knit a couple stitches and then join in the new yarn here. I like to do it right there at the edge. This will eventually be hidden by a seam if you're going to be seaming it. So whether you decide to knot the yarn loosely, go back and unknot it and weave those in later, or hold them together and knit, whatever you decide, you're going to want to come up with some way to keep it secure, because the alternative is to just start knitting with your new yarn, which is totally fine if you can manage it. But I find that when I do this, I go back and I look at that stitch, and this tends to get really loose. And it can be really hard to seam that. It also can be hard to tighten it up. You can tighten it up somewhat, but it's just not very neat. So I recommend finding a way that you like to keep those pretty secure when you're joining a new yarn. Let's talk about another situation. So I'm going to keep knitting this row. Another situation that you might have is that you need to join new yarn in the middle of a project that does not have a side seam. Let's say you're knitting a stockinette sweater in the round, and you reach a point where you run out of yarn, you need to join new yarn. What do? I'm going to show you one of my absolute favorite tricks, and it's called the Spit Splice. And yes, it's a little gross, but you don't need to use spit. You just need to get the yarn moist. And basically what we're going to do is felt the yarn together. So this obviously will only work with wool fibers. It can work with wool alpaca blends, but it might take a little while. Leave the edges a little bit rough. This is going to be easier to felt. You can tease it apart a little bit. Do the same with your other end. And if it has 2 plies, like this strand of yarn does, you can even take away one of the plies on each side. I'm just going to try this as is. Overlap the strands. And this is where you are going to want to get this wet, either with water or spit. Okay. After you've gotten it wet, I can just let you assume that I did it in the most ladylike fashion. You're going to rub these strands together and make sure they don't come apart. Keep them overlapped in your hand. You can check on it every once in a while. Just rub your hands back and forth really fast. You want to build up some heat, because what you're doing is you're felting. You're agitating the fibers and interlocking them to join them. So I'm tugging on it pretty firmly. You can see that it's felted just fine, totally secure. And can you see the join? I mean, you might see where the yarn is a little messy, but I can't really tell where I've joined it. Once you're confident that the fibers have been felted together, you can just continue to knit. You might have a little, I didn't do it that well, let's see. Just make sure that any ends that maybe didn't get felted in end up towards the back of the work. And once it's knit in, it's going to be totally secure, I promise. I've done this on a lot of sweaters. And I just want to preface all of this by saying that everyone has their own tips and tricks. I polled everyone in our office, and I basically came to the conclusion that you should use what works for you and your specific project and yarn. And you probably want to know a few methods, and I'm going to show you a few, just so you can figure out, you know, what works for that specific situation. So let's say this is the wrong side of stockinette. Actually, I'm going to get the yarn up to the stockinette portion, because right here I have some garter on the edges. What I like to do to hide my ends is I like to go and I basically retrace, or not retrace, I go into the backs. Let's see, here's a purl bump. I go in there, and then there's one right next to it. I go down through there. So, you know, these are what I would call the umbrellas and the smiles, the upside down and the right side up purl bumps. Just go back and weave in your ends. I actually like to reverse the direction at some point. Let's say I've woven in for about an inch. Go back and do the same right on top of what you just did. Some people like to go down in a diagonal. I don't know why, something about me just, that bothers me. Could be a Virgo type A linear thing, I don't know. Just bugs me to see diagonal and all the rest of the knitting is so grid-like. But you know what? If it's a bulky yarn, that could actually help to hide the bulk if it's not all built up in one spot, so maybe I don't mind it that much. So we've talked about how to weave in wool yarns, and wool alpaca blends are really, they tend to be well behaved because they are naturally sticky and they stick to themselves and they don't slide everywhere. But let's say you're working in a cotton or silk blend, and let's say that it's plied. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate those plies. Let's pretend this is a cotton silk blend. And I'm going to, let's see, this is wool, so it's sticking together. What you're going to do, or if it's a chunky yarn actually, this works well for chunky yarns as well, you can split the ply, and this is practically roving, so I'm going to want to be really careful because it's just going to want to come apart like cotton candy. Split the ply and weave in however you are choosing to weave in the ends. Oops. In one direction with one of the plies. You could probably guess where I'm going with this. Go back and weave that other ply in the opposite direction. And that just splits up the bulk, and for cotton and silk it makes it a little harder for everything to come undone. Another trick people might recommend for cotton and silk is you can actually sew the ends down. Let's say you're weaving into a corner, you can actually get cotton sewing thread and a regular sewing needle and tack it down a little bit. That'll keep it from sliding. Fray check, nail polish, things like that that keep, you can knot it really tightly and then put something like that on it to keep it in place if you're really worried. You know, anytime you can avoid a knot in knitting, it's good, but if you are going to make a knot, it does make sense to secure it somehow. Okay, I think I've shared all my tips, and I hope this helps you weaving in ends. Finishing, not that bad.